Marvel Snap's newest season pass card, Stryfe, is looking like a bit of an all-star. With a 4.6 stat line, he's a little bit understated, but his objective of play 3 on reveals and in return use the highest cost on reveal card in your hand means that he is going to be a very potent piece of any deck that is looking to take advantage of specific high cost on reveals. He has a couple of best friends here. There are going to be cards that are going to be fairly inextricably tied to Stryfe throughout the course of his existence in the current era of Marvel Snap. That makes sense, right? This is a card that is meant to copy a big, expensive on reveal. There actually aren't too many cards in the space that he is trying to copy. There are a couple of big, expensive on reveals, and he really only wants to deal with the tippy-toppest of the tippy-top tier. For example, by far the most common thing that I've seen with Stryfe so far is using him in the context of Fin Fang Foom. And there are a couple of different ways in which you can use him in the context of Fin Fang Foom. Star-Lord and Pixie seem to be the ones that I see the most, but mostly you are doing things with him and Fin Fang Foom. This is not necessarily because Fin Fang Foom is particularly busted, but because if you actually go through the cards in Marvel Snap and look for on reveals that give power to the card itself, there actually aren't a lot of them at higher cost amounts. Fin Fang Foom also costs 7, so it frees you up to run 6s in your deck if you want to be able to make sure that Stryfe is always going to target Fin Fang Foom. This is also a good time to talk about a specific interaction that Stryfe has. Note that in Stryfe's wording, it specifies cost with a capital C. That means even if you pixie Fin Fang Foom to be 1 cost, it will still register as a 7 cost card, and Stryfe will target it. Another 6 cost card that I've seen people messing around with as a Stryfe targeting bonus is Aurora. Now, Aurora is a card that you definitely want to get multiple copies of per game, and that is a very important aspect to why Stryfe makes sense in sort of small ball Aurora decks. I've seen Thanos Aurora with Stryfe, I've seen normal Aurora with Stryfe, and we're going to talk about both of those decks when we get into the actual deck list part. However, the main point here is when you're playing those decks, they are kind of a new entry into the canon, and it's gonna be a little bit before we know if Stryfe Aurora is worth doing instead of, say, just being a Doom 2099 deck instead. These are new entrants to the realm of, say, meta decks, these double Aurora decks. Early results have been fairly promising, but I want to make sure people know that these are still in an experimental phase. Star-Lord Master of the Sun is a deck that you're going to see a lot of Stryfe in, although you often aren't really trying to do Stryfe Star-Lord. A lot of what Stryfe does in Star-Lord decks is actually just sort of raise the floor a little bit. Like, for example, the big thing to understand about the way Stryfe works with Arnim Zola, for example, is he will be a new copy of himself. So he'll keep whatever stats he got from his previous on reveal, and then he will register that you have completed his quest and trigger that quest again on each of the Zolid copies. So what this does in Star-Lord decks is raise the floor pretty significantly in a couple of ways. Stryfe a Fin Fang Foom and then Zola that Fin Fang Foom is the same line that we were already doing as a backup plan with Wave in those decks. Now you have more ways to make it happen. The other thing Stryfe does is that if you can get to just even 8 energy and you have a Fin Fang Foom, a Stryfe, and a Juggernaut in hand, you get access to Fin Fang Foom Juggernaut effectively off of the Stryfe. And since Stryfe is an end of turn timing, he happens after end of turns, actually, that's when objective checks. That means that you can get a better Fin Fang Foom in some situations to go along with that Juggernaut that probably wins the lane for the low cost of 8 energy in a deck that previously backup plan was get to 11 energy so I could actually play Fin Fang Foom and a Juggernaut. So he's a floor raiser in these decks for sure. I haven't been as impressed with him in Sholau as you might think. He's not like he's bad or anything or like that, but it's just that your early turns before the Sholau are usually better suited playing a different doubler. Like, you'd rather be a Scarlet Spider gamer, you'd rather be a Maverick gamer most of the time than using a second Sholau on the Stryfe, because you have that extra turn to get that double off, right? The Sholau you play on 6 onto that Maverick is going to have 3 extra points. The Sholau you play on 6 onto that Maverick is going to have 3 extra points, and the Stryfe won't, is the key thing there. Like, if you're playing that Stryfe on 5, that's cool. It's still a little bit worse than just playing a card that actually doubles the full-on Sholau buff. So I've been a little bit surprised at how not elite he's felt in Sholau shells. So let's start with at least some of the more interesting Stryfe stuff, which to me is pretty clearly the Aurora stuff. I think that's like an actual interesting dimension that is being added to the deck. Aurora decks typically are being overshadowed by Doom 2099 Aurora decks, but there are some real upsides towards actually being just a baseline Aurora deck, such as increased flexibility and more of an ability to like run tech that isn't just a Cosmic Ghost Rider. And in a Thanos context, you also get this additional stuff like being able to have access to Mockingbird, the upside of the stones with an Aurora deck, a small package that includes a Gambit, which is a pretty useful card. Even if it doesn't get buffed by Aurora, it covers some of the weaknesses against Sholau and other decks like that these decks tend to have. Just a wide-ranging amount of tech that is brought together by the idea that you can just like play a Stryfe on 5, have it be Aurora with a stone, and then also play an Aurora on 6, and just having that amount of output means that you snowball and roll downhill really, really well. Thanos is a deck that is often held back by its own lack of output. And when it is good, it's good in the context of being a deck that can have a lot of tech cards and still have a lot of output, right? And if you look at this deck, it's actually doing a pretty good job of that. You have the output of double Auroras, you have Cosmic Ghost Rider, you have Gambit Horseman of Death, you have Stardust, you have all of these ways in which you can customize this deck to the metagame and beat what your opponent is doing and not sacrifice points while you're doing it. And that is the thing that Stryfe is really bringing to the table here. The problem is that you kind of don't have other targets for him. So he's extremely good when you're doing this. But if you are not doing this, you are very much locked in on being a very mediocre list. I do feel like he's an upgrade in here because what he brings to the deck in terms of getting that second Aurora is so valuable for a deck that is full of these like relatively mopey but potentially potent tech cards that just sort of sit on the board and do stuff. But I do think that it puts an even greater premium on drawing well in this list. This is a list that now even more is dedicated to like, if I get that Mind Stone, that's when things start popping off, because I get the Mind Stone, I draw 2 cards out of the deck, I keep drawing, I'm rolling downhill, I'm putting stuff on the board for Aurora. By drawing those cards, I'm making it more likely that I have my Aurora in hand and that I get to my Stryfe and he can see the Aurora in my hand. It's a very downhill deck. So your first few turns are going to kind of determine the entire rest of the game. When you clunk in a list like this, it is embarrassing. So you do have to be aware of that. Husky Puppies has been messing around with an Aurora Stryfe list that is wholly Aurora dedicated. And I do want to give a shout out to Husky Puppies here, because this is definitely a space that he's kind of been the only person I've seen exploring since Aurora came out. The like really super small ball Captain Carter Aurora thing, where it looks like a deck that is just going to try to be more than the sum of its parts and just really get to a point where the power output is immense. It does that, right? And the major upside of a deck like this is power output, and also you get to be a Cosmo deck. Like, you have these disruptive pieces. There's an Iceman, there's a Cosmo, you're doing things, you're outputting points. And then it all comes together with Aurora, and of course, Stryfe is here specifically to target the Aurora. This is a deck that, like, the Adam Warlock actually ends up being kind of important, because again, it's similar to the Thanos thing. When it all comes together, you're really doing things. And I think people might not respect how much you're actually doing when you're doing what this deck is doing. But if you are not rolling downhill early, your deck starts to clunk very hard later in the game. And that dynamic is still true here. This is a pretty classic Cosmo mid-rangey deck that is just looking to do, like, you know, a Cosmo read on 5, and then, you know, maybe we'll get the Aurora out, we'll get the Stryfe out, we'll do something like that. Our power output is large when we do this. Like, there's really no other way to state it. There's a lot of very powerful 3s in here that love getting double targeted by things like Aurora. and a lot of just generally pretty decent cards. It's a very appealing deck to me personally, but the big worry here is that it's just too small ball and just too finicky. It's time to stop having fun. Stryfe is a little bit of a floor raiser in decks like this. This is, of course, the deck I did a video on like 3 days ago. It's Star-Lord. It's Star-Lord. We're playing Star-Lord still. And it is largely floor raising in a couple of very specific ways. So there's a couple of interactions you should probably know about. The first one is Stryfe goes at the end of the turn. That's when objectives go off typically, right? And that means that if you are Fin Fang Fooming off of your Stryfe, you can play it and it will hit the things your opponent plays there after you. That's a really important aspect of this. Now, the other thing you should know interaction-wise, and I think we covered this a little bit earlier, but it's worth repeating, Arnim Zola works weird with this card. I think it works in a way that is intuitive to me, but might not be intuitive to everybody. And what I mean by that is Stryfe cannot be Absorbing Manned, he cannot be Grandmastered, he doesn't have an on-reveal. So you might be a little confused when you Arnim Zola a Stryfe and the on-reveal effect goes off again. What's actually happening there is you are Arnim Zolaing a Stryfe, and the new copies of Stryfe have not completed his quest, but they see that you have done all the things that indicate the quest is completed, so they complete it again. This means that you can do something like Stryfe on 4, have it be a Fin Fang Foom, Zola that, it's still a Fin Fang Foom in your hand, and then boom, you are looking at the classic double Fin Fang Foom line that this deck is a big fan of. The other thing Stryfe does as a floor raiser is allow you to play Juggernaut Fin Fang, where Fin Fang is Stryfe, for only 8 energy. This is very beneficial to you because it means that your bad Star-Lord draws can now get to that line. Again, it's not like it's seriously incentivizing this deck to do more than it normally does. That's normally in the range of this deck. But what it's doing is it's raising the floor. A lot of their bad draws are now draws that can actually win games because that's what Stryfe is bringing here. Another Star-Lord Zola Fin Fang Foom Stryfe deck you can be playing is the Phoenix Force version with Firehair that is looking to duplicate on reveals as much as possible. Stryfe, again, is providing mostly utility in terms of raising the floor of decks like this. These are decks that have remarkably high ceilings, but the floors are really where they suffer. In much the same way as Star-Lord supplemented Mr. Negative's floor last season before the nerf, now Stryfe is supplementing Star-Lord's floor by providing you Stryfe Zola games that are just actual games of Marvel Snap you can win because that playline is so powerful that don't necessarily demand all of the cheaty things that your deck is doing actually happen that game. This means that you are able to establish dominant positions in games that you would otherwise not be doing well in. In other words, what Stryfe is providing to a deck like this is the ability to limp more profitably. When you and your opponent are both not doing what they do, normally that factor tends to favor a mid-range gamer. Their ranges are more compressed. The whole point of a combo deck like this is that when you peak super high. But what Stryfe does is raise the floor a little bit higher so that you can play real games against people with your backup plan. You can beat people by simply strifing into a Fin Fang Foom, blowing it up and reviving it. That is a very valid thing for you to do. You no longer need to use Wave in order to access that Fin Fang Foom playline. You can just Stryfe it out. And he comes with some additional upsides as well. I don't know where this one comes from. The comments will probably have to tell me, but this is a list that I've been seeing a fairly decent amount of. It's just using Stryfe as a way to supplement the Wiccan deck. Wiccan is an archetype that has largely lacked for power. And what this deck is trying to do is add Dragon Lord, add in Stryfe to get your Fin Fang Foom, and suddenly you're starting to really compete on the axis that combo decks compete on. Wiccan as an archetype has been in the doghouse a little bit because largely the utility of Wiccan decks was to go over other more techy mid-range decks back before they nerfed all the tech stuff, and now he's just sort of hanging on like a vestigial tail. This is still a deck though, that when you introduce those cheating elements, starts to be able to compete on a game-to-game basis against decks that largely are more combo-oriented. Multiple Fin Fang Fooms is a great way to take your stodgy, old, boring mid-range deck and make it actually powerful. Unfortunately, I just don't really buy that Wiccan is the best place to be doing this. We've talked about a bunch of decks that are doing multiple Fin Fang Fooms. It's a large part of what Stryfe is. So while I do believe that maybe it's an upgrade here just because of how generally medium Wiccan decks can be, I find it hard to believe that this is going to be the best implementation of strifing some Fooms. I did a little bit of this, and it was basically fine. I've got no real complaints about the way that this deck played out, but largely the big thing I took away from this list was that it's kind of light on power. There are really only 2 cards in the deck that are actually meaningfully making power, and I think that largely it ends up being like the 3rd best Show Lao list rather than the best Show Lao list. Largely, I suspect that Show Lao is an archetype that is going to end up being what it was. Stryfe is cool, it's a nice little dalliance, but I suspect we're going to be on Activate Show Lao before long, and that's totally fine. It's a very reasonable thing to try out a new card and see how it goes. I will say the major dynamic that makes Show Lao Stryfe not particularly enjoyable is just that you have so many better doublers in the natural package, right? When you Show Lao on the final turn, it's going to have 3 more power than Show Lowing on 5. So what's really the point of playing a Stryfe instead of a Maverick or a Stryfe instead of a Scarlet Spider? It's largely stacked up in such a way that I think he very much is out of the Show Lao game if you're really going to get down to it. Ika's been messing around in a similar space, and I think here's where we start to see Stryfe become sort of a more codified card, right? Where it's like, you have something that's a little bit light on power, and much like we're doing with the Wiccan deck, what we're doing is we're just injecting Stryfe Fin Fang Foom into it and saying that we've made the deck better. And it's interesting because I think that there are 2 ways to look at this. The first way is you have made a worse Stryfe Fin Fang Foom decks than the dedicated Stryfe Fin Fang Foom decks. The second is you have improved the deck you are playing by including these things. And I think either one is a valid way to think about things like this, depending on the context, but it's definitely going to be a bit of an eye of the beholder kind of thing. I would expect to see a lot of this Stryfe and Foom propping up bad archetypes kind of deal. No offense to Ika, but I think we both know what's going on here. This is the Ika classic. And I think that this is a very, it's a very reasonable thing to be doing, and you're just like, let me inject some more ceiling into my deck. I wonder if that's kind of the future that Stryfe is going to have. Like, to use a basketball analogy, he's not LeBron, he's not Dwayne Wade, but he is Chris Bosh. And it's like, that's a really versatile piece that can really raise the floor of some of the kind of things that you're going to see in Marvel Snap. But it might not be what that deck specifically wants to do. Just sort of injecting the brute power of Stryfe Foom into really any deck that can afford to play it is probably going to be good, but it might not be good for the deck. You know, the operation succeeded, but the patient died kind of things. So when I saw this card and I did my star ratings, I rated him a 3.5. I'm feeling right now that might be a little bit low. Right now, I'm looking at Stryfe as maybe a 4. This is a pretty good card, but it is important to note that if people use these things as let's say you're like, oh, I'm going to watch KMBest video, decide whether to buy this. First of all, don't do that. I take no responsibility for your purchases. Second of all, it's important to understand, if you are someone who's thinking about it like that, Stryfe is very siloed. There are not a lot of things this works with, right? So that means he's going to be very sensitive to balance changes to those things. This is not a card that's going to be able to find other homes if the things that he's doing are good enough that it's going to be problematic. This is the card that is going to be doing extremely specific things. I'm not exactly sure what analogy to draw for him, but largely where I'm at with him is that he's extremely good at a couple of super specific things, but he's not the headliner there, right? Fin Fang Foom is the headliner. Star-Lord is the headliner. Those are the headliners in those decks, and he is a good supporting piece to those cards. And so it's a weird kind of texture for a card like this to have if you're really what about this season pass? Because he is a relevant and interesting card that has very few homes. But those homes, it doesn't matter how few homes you have. when you can just sort of make anything your home by putting Stryfe, Fin Fang Foom into any deck that can play him, right? Like there's a couple of interesting dynamics going on with him where I think the Chris Bosch comparison is really where I'm at here. This is not 1A, but it is a really helpful thing to have if you are already in the 1A business. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.